The world grows quiet, and the story begins. Welcome, everyone, to the Sounds of Stories. Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to the Sounds of Stories. Tonight's tale is The Angel of the Odd Revised, written by Edgar Allan Poe. While Poe is best known for dark classics like The Telltale Heart and The Raven, many readers are surprised to discover that he also possessed a sharp and playful sense of humor. The Angel of the Odd is one of his funniest works. It's a bizarre and satirical story about coincidence, bad luck, and the dangers of being a little too certain that you're always right. For this adaptation, we've leaned into that humor even further, expanding the comedy while preserving the spirit of Poe's original tale. So, if you hear a few extra laughs along the way, consider it our humble contribution to the Angel's work. And now, let the pages turn. The revised version of The Angel of the Odd by Edgar Allan Poe. The Angel of the Odd Revised, written by Edgar Allan Poe. If there's one fault for which I've been repeatedly criticized throughout my life, it's my stubborn refusal to believe in things that make no sense. Ghosts, omens, fortune-tellers, prophecies, curses, destiny, luck. I've always regarded such things with the same level of respect one might afford a goat attempting to lecture on astronomy. That's to say, none whatsoever. I considered myself a practical man, a rational man, a man who preferred evidence over imagination and facts over fantasy. If an event occurred, there was a reason for it. If an accident happened, someone had made a mistake. It's that simple. At least, that's what I believed. The events I'm about to relate didn't immediately change my mind. In fact, I resisted the lesson with remarkable determination. Unfortunately, reality proved even more stubborn than I was. The affair began on a miserable evening. Rain rattled against the windows, and the wind made occasional attempts to remove portions of the roof. I'd settled comfortably beside the fire with a newspaper and a generous glass of wine. The newspaper, like most newspapers, was filled with stories that seemed determined to convince the public that the universe had abandoned all reason. One article concerned a gentleman who had survived a shipwreck only to choke on a fishbone while celebrating his rescue. Another described a woman who escaped a burning building and was immediately struck by a falling chimney. And a third involved a man whose horse had wandered away, only to return several days later accompanied by 3 additional horses that nobody could identify. I lowered the paper and shook my head. What nonsense! The stories were presented as though they were examples of fate, proof that mysterious forces governed human affairs. To me, they were merely accidents, coincidences. The sort of random events that occurred naturally when enough people spent enough time making poor decisions. Then, I took another sip of wine. The more I read, the more ridiculous the articles became. Before long, I found myself laughing out loud. Not politely, not quietly. The sort of laughter one reserves for particularly foolish ideas. I was in the middle of congratulating myself on my superior common sense when all of a sudden, someone knocked on the door. The sound was so sudden and so forceful that I nearly spilled my wine. 3 heavy blows. Not the knock of a visitor, but the knock of a man who expected obedience. I frowned. The hour was late, the weather was dreadful, and I wasn't expecting company. But the knocking came again. 3 sharp reports that echoed through the house. Reluctantly, I rose from my chair. Had I possessed any wisdom whatsoever, I would have remained where I was. Instead, I crossed the room and opened the door. The figure standing on the threshold was like anyone I had ever seen. For several seconds, I simply stared. The stranger was short and remarkably round. His face was bright red, his nose appeared to have been shaped by repeated disagreements with solid objects, and his clothing looked as though it had been assembled from whatever garments had survived several unrelated disasters. Nothing matched, nothing fit. His coat strained against its buttons, and his hat leaned at a dangerous angle. One boot was considerably larger than the other. But most remarkable of all was the powerful scent of alcohol surrounding him. The man smelled less as though he had been drinking whiskey and more as though he had recently emerged from a barrel of it. The stranger removed his hat and bowed. "Good evening," he said. Then he hiccuped. Then he bowed again. Then he announced with great dignity, "I am the Angel of the Odd." I blinked. The stranger smiled. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat. "I beg your pardon?" I said. "The Angel of the Odd." He pronounced the title carefully, as though it were a position of enormous importance. When I failed to respond, he sighed. "You don't believe me." "I don't believe I understood you." The little man looked disappointed. Then, without waiting for an invitation, he rushed past me and entered the house. I protested immediately. He ignored me completely. By the time I'd recovered from my surprise, he had already settled himself into a chair beside the fire. The chair creaked ominously. The visitor appeared unconcerned. In fact, he seemed perfectly at home. A moment later, he produced a bottle from somewhere inside his coat. To this day, I can't explain how it fit there. The coat itself was hardly large enough to contain the man, yet somehow it contained an entire bottle. He removed the cork, took a long drink, then another, then a third. Only then did he appear ready for conversation. "You have been reading stories about strange accidents," he said. I stared. The newspaper lay folded beside my chair. "I have." "And you think they're nonsense?" "I do." The little man nodded thoughtfully. Then he pointed the bottle toward me. "That's because you misunderstand my work." "Your work?" "My profession." The stranger puffed out his chest. "I supervise improbable events." I laughed. The statement was absurd. But the little man didn't appear offended. Instead, he waited patiently until I finished. "You supervise improbable events." "Exactly." "What does that even mean?" His eyes brightened, the way a craftsman's eyes brighten when discussing a beloved trade. "It means," he said, "that ordinary things are somebody else's responsibility." He leaned forward. "But usual things," a grin spread slowly across his face, "those belong to me." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain continued its assault on the windows, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the strange little man sat comfortably in my chair drinking my wine as though he owned both the house and the evening. I remained standing, partly because I was offended, partly because I was trying to determine whether I was awake. At length, I cleared my throat. "Let me see if I understand you correctly." The angel gestured grandly with his bottle. "A sensible place to begin. You're claiming to be responsible for accidents." "Not all accidents." He waggled a finger. "Only the interesting ones." I rubbed my temples. This conversation was rapidly becoming exhausting. "Perhaps an example would help." The angel brightened. "Oh, yes, examples are always helpful." He settled deeper into the chair and crossed his legs. "When a man slips because he's careless," he shrugged, "that's ordinary. When a man slips because a fish falls from the sky, strikes a passing dog, frightens a horse, startles a baker, and causes a wheelbarrow to roll across the street at precisely the wrong moment—" His smile widened. "That is one of mine." I stared. The angel nodded proudly. "A beautiful piece of work, that one." I began to suspect the man was insane. Unfortunately, he was so thoroughly convinced of his own nonsense that arguing with him felt strangely pointless. "Then tell me this," I said. "Why would such a thing happen at all?" The angel took another drink. "Because people need reminding." "Reminding of what?" "That they're not nearly as clever as they think." I laughed. The little man did not. In fact, he regarded me with an expression that suggested he had spent centuries observing the consequences of overconfidence. "Humans enjoy certainty," he said. "They create explanations for everything. They arrange the world into neat little boxes and convince themselves that they understand it." "And they don't?" The angel barked a laugh. The sound was somewhere between a cough and a hiccup. "My dear fellow, half of humanity cannot locate its spectacles while wearing them." I opened my mouth, but then I closed it again, because the unfortunate truth was that I had done precisely that earlier in the week. The angel noticed my hesitation. His grin became unbearable. "You see? Coincidence. Of course. Nothing more. Naturally." His agreement somehow felt insulting. The little man rose from the chair and wandered toward the window. Outside, the storm had grown worse. Wind rattled the glass and rain swept across the street in silver sheets. The angel watched it for a moment. Then he spoke without turning around. "Tell me something." "What?" "Have you ever experienced an event so unlikely that it made you pause?" "No." The answer came too quickly. The angel chuckled. "That means yes." "I assure you it does not." "Oh, but it does." He turned and pointed the neck of the bottle at me. "Every person has one." "I don't." "You do." "I don't." The angel nodded. "You've just forgotten about it." I folded my arms. The conversation had begun to resemble an argument between a schoolmaster and an exceptionally stubborn student. Unfortunately, I could not decide which of us occupied which role. The little man returned to the fire and studied me carefully. Then, to my annoyance, he smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but a patient smile. A smile of someone waiting for a trap to spring. "You truly believe the world is entirely responsible?" "I do." "You believe everything happens according to predictable causes?" "Yes." "You believe strange accidents are merely accidents?" "Obviously." The angel nodded. Then he took one final drink from the bottle. A very long drink. When he lowered it, the bottle was empty. He looked almost mournful. Slowly, he replaced the cork, tucked the bottle back inside his impossible coat, and stood. "Well," he said. "Well, what?" "Then I suppose there's nothing more to discuss." I blinked. That was not the response I expected. "You mean you're leaving?" The angel looked surprised. "Certainly." "Just like that?" "Just like that." He collected his hat and brushed an imaginary speck of dust from the sleeve of his coat. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed entirely serious. No grin, no laughter, no mischief. Just a peculiar calm. But at the door, he paused. The storm howled outside. The house creaked. The fire snapped behind us. Then the angel turned. "I should warn you." I rolled my eyes. "Of course you should." He ignored the remark. "You have spent the entire evening mocking my profession." "Your imaginary profession." "Call it what you like." He tilted his head slightly. "But if I were you," his voice softened, "I would pay very close attention over the next few days." I laughed. I couldn't help myself. The warning was simply too ridiculous. The angel sighed, not angrily, but sadly, as though he had hoped for better. "You really don't learn, do you?" "I learn from evidence." "Then evidence you shall have." The words were spoken almost casually, yet something about them made the room feel colder. The angel opened the door. A gust of wind swept inside. Rain splattered across the floor. For a brief moment, his silhouette stood framed against the darkness. Then he stepped out into the storm. I hurried forward, not because I intended to stop him, but because I suddenly realized I had dozens of questions. When I reached the doorway, however, the street was empty. Completely empty. No retreating figure, no footsteps, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Only rain. Endless rain. I stood there for several seconds. Then I laughed once more. A little less confidently than before, but still, I laughed. After all, what other response was there? An intoxicated stranger had wandered into my home, delivered a lecture on improbable accidents, claimed responsibility for coincidence itself, and vanished into a storm. The only reasonable conclusion was that the man had been a lunatic. Possibly a very entertaining lunatic, but a lunatic nonetheless. Satisfied with this explanation, I returned to my chair. I poured myself another glass of wine, I picked up the newspaper, and thought no more about the Angel of the Odd. And that, as it happened, was my first mistake. The following morning arrived bright, clear, and entirely free of angels. I woke feeling considerably better than I had the previous evening. The storm had passed, sunlight poured through the windows, birds sang outside. But most importantly, the strange visitor already seemed ridiculous. By breakfast, I had convinced myself the entire affair was nothing more than an amusing encounter with an eccentric drunk. By luncheon, I was laughing about it. By supper, I had nearly forgotten it altogether. It was astonishing how quickly confidence returns to a man when reality has not yet begun correcting him. And for the next several days, life proceeded normally. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed, no fish fell from the heavens, no mysterious angels emerged from cupboards. The world behaved exactly as I expected. Naturally, this convinced me I had been right all along. But there's perhaps no greater creature in creation more dangerous than a man whose bad assumptions have temporarily gone unpunished. Several days later, while enjoying a quiet afternoon, I happened to glance out a second-story window. The view was incredible. A pleasant street, a few pedestrians, a delivery wagon, a cat conducting whatever mysterious business occupies the minds of cats. And yet, something caught my attention. Across the street stood a woman, a remarkably attractive woman. Now, I should explain that I wasn't ordinarily a foolish man, at least not intentionally. Unfortunately, attractions ruin judgment of better men than myself. The lady stood near a shop entrance speaking with a companion. She laughed at something that had been said, and I found myself watching longer than was strictly necessary. Then, longer still. Then, considerably longer. A sensible person would have continued observing from the window. I was not that sensible person. Instead, I leaned forward. It was just a little, but then the woman adjusted her hat. I leaned farther. The woman smiled. I leaned farther still. At this point, the law of physics, which are notoriously unsympathetic to human vanity, began to intervene. My center of gravity shifted. The chair beneath me slid slightly backward. I realized my mistake, at precisely the same moment the mistake became irreversible. There's few sensations more unpleasant than recognizing disaster several seconds before it arrives. The chair tipped, my arms flailed, the window frame rushed toward me. For one glorious instant, I believed I had recovered my balance. I had not. The next moment, I found myself plunging headfirst through the open window. The experience was brief, violent, and deeply educational. Fortunately, a length of laundry line happened to be hanging nearby. Unfortunately, my descent introduced me to it in a manner neither of us appreciated. The line caught me. Not comfortably, not safely, but effectively. One moment I was falling toward the street. The next, I was dangling several stories above it, twisted into a position that would have impressed a circus performer and horrified a physician. I hung there in stunned silence. The crowd below me did not. Within seconds, people began gathering. Now, human beings possess many admirable qualities, but discretion is rarely among them. And that was true in this instant because faces appeared everywhere. Windows opened, doors swung open, pedestrians stopped, children pointed, someone laughed. I sincerely hope that individual later stepped on a rake. It was now I attempted to free myself. This only worsened the matter. The rope tightened, my coat became entangled. One boot slipped off and landed somewhere below. The crowd found this tremendously entertaining. As I struggled, a familiar voice drifted upward, a voice I had hoped never to hear again. Interesting. My blood ran cold. Slowly, very slowly, I looked down. There, standing among the spectators, was the Angel of the Odd. He appeared delighted. The little man was carrying the same crooked hat, the same oversized coat, and, unless my eyes deceived me, the same bottle. He tipped the hat politely. "Good afternoon." I stared at him. He stared at me. Then he gestured toward my predicament. "Gravity remains one of our most reliable employees." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. My humiliation was apparently becoming a public performance. "What are you doing here?" I hissed. The angel looked genuinely surprised. "Watching." "Watching what?" His grin widened. "The evidence." Several members of the crowd laughed again. I considered strangling him. This was difficult for two reasons. First, I was suspended 30 feet above the ground, and second, I strongly suspected strangling an angel might invoke paperwork. Then the angel folded his arms. "Still believe everything is perfectly reasonable?" "Yes." The answer emerged with more force than dignity. The angel nodded approvingly. "Good." "Good?" "I admire commitment." A rescue was eventually organized. Ladders appeared, instructions were shouted. Advice was offered by people who had never rescued anyone in their lives. After what felt like several years, I was finally lowered to safety. The crowd applauded, actually applauded, as though I had chosen to perform the entire affair for their amusement. I then staggered away without speaking to anyone, especially the angel. By the time I reached home, my clothes were torn, my pride was shattered, and my patience had reached dangerous levels. Yet, despite everything, despite the fall, despite the crowd, despite the angel's appearance, I still refused to surrender. Accidents happen. People make mistakes. Coincidences occur. That was all. Nothing more, nothing less. I repeated this argument to myself several dozen times while repairing the damage to my dignity. The reasoning sounded perfectly convincing, at least until I remembered the angel's smile. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Not because it was threatening, not because it was cruel, but because it suggested he knew something I did not. And that possibility, that tiny possibility, was beginning to bother me, and bother me far more than I wished to admit. Now, a wise man, having survived a humiliating fall from a second-story window, might have chosen to become more cautious. A wiser man might even have reconsidered certain firmly held opinions. I did neither of those. In fact, the incident had the opposite effect. The appearance of the angel beneath my dangling form irritated me so profoundly that I became determined to prove him wrong. Not privately, not philosophically, publicly. I wanted evidence. I wanted certainty. But most of all, I wanted to wipe that ridiculous smile from his ridiculous face. The more I thought about the matter, the more convinced I became that the angel had simply taken advantage of an unfortunate accident. Now think about this. Nothing supernatural had occurred, nothing mysterious. I had leaned too far out a window while admiring a beautiful woman. An embarrassing explanation, certainly, but hardly a supernatural one. By the end of the week, I had rebuilt my confidence, or more accurately, I had rebuilt enough of it to become dangerous again. One afternoon, while sorting through a collection of papers, letters, and neglected financial records, I made a discovery. A very unpleasant discovery. Among the documents was a notice concerning a distant relative whose estate was being settled. An estate which, according to the letter, included a substantial inheritance. An inheritance that would become mine, provided I appear in person before a specified deadline. I checked the date, then checked it again, then a third time. My stomach dropped. The deadline was approaching. Rapidly, far too rapidly. For several moments, I simply stared at the letter. Then I leapt from my chair and began preparing for immediate travel. The fortune wasn't enormous, but it was certainly large enough to transform a comfortable life into a very comfortable one. And upon seeing that, there was no question about it. I must leave at once. And, like countless intelligent men before me, I abandoned all caution the moment money became involved. The following morning, I was hurrying through the city at a pace that would have alarmed my physician. Every delay felt catastrophic, every red light intolerable, every slow-moving pedestrian a personal insult. The deadline loomed before me like an approaching execution. At last, I arrived at the transportation office, breathless, sweating, victorious, only to discover that I had arrived approximately 30 seconds too late. The vehicle had already departed. I stood frozen. The clerk behind the counter offered a sympathetic shrug. It was the sort of shrug that should be outlawed, a shrug that says, "Your problem is unfortunate, but it's also no longer my problem." I turned away in despair, and there, naturally, stood the angel of the odd. He was examining a wall map. At least he appeared to be examining it, but in reality, he was watching me. The grin arrived slowly, like sunrise. "Oh, dear," he said. I clenched my fists. "Oh, dear?" I repeated. "Terrible luck. Luck had nothing to do with it." The angel nodded. "Of course not." "You're enjoying this." "Immensely." The honesty was infuriating. I stepped toward him. The angel stepped backward, not fearful, but playful, like a man teasing an angry dog through a fence. "This proves nothing." "Naturally." "It was a scheduling error." "Absolutely." "I simply arrived too late." "By mere coincidence." The angel's eyes sparkled. I wanted to throw him into a river, but instead I stormed away. The inheritance still remained. Missing one departure didn't mean defeat. Another opportunity would present itself. At least, that's what I believed. Unfortunately, the universe had apparently developed an interest in the discussion. The next several days became a parade of increasingly improbable obstacles. A missed connection, a broken wheel, a lodging error, a misplaced document. Each problem by itself was manageable. Together, they formed a conspiracy. Not an actual conspiracy, a conspiracy of circumstances. The kind that causes reasonable people to stare at ceilings at 3 o'clock in the morning, wondering whether reality is making jokes at their expense. And throughout it all, the angel appeared. Never long, never often, just enough. A glimpse across a crowded street, a familiar laugh from a passing carriage, a crooked hat vanishing around a corner. Always smiling, always watching, always waiting. By now, I had become less interested in the inheritance than in defeating him. But this was a mistake, a very large mistake, because obsession narrows a man's vision. He stops seeing the road, stops seeing the cliff, stops seeing the warning signs, and before long, he's sprinting toward disaster while congratulating himself on his determination. Well, my disaster arrived in the form of a newspaper advertisement. The notice described an aerial exhibition involving a hot air balloon. Such demonstrations were becoming increasingly fashionable at the time, and the operator promised a magnificent ascent. The moment I saw the advertisement, an idea occurred to me. A terrible idea. The sort of idea that feels brilliant until several years later. The balloon, I reasoned, would allow me to travel quickly. More importantly, it would allow me to bypass the endless change of mishaps that seemed determined to block my path. No roads, no delays, no missed departures, no interference. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. The next morning, I arrived at the exhibition grounds. The balloon towered above the crowd. Immense, magnificent, its great envelope strained against the ropes holding it to earth. People pointed upward in admiration. Children laughed. Vendors shouted. The entire scene felt festive, triumphant, as though nothing could possibly go wrong, which in hindsight should have worried me. Then I heard a familiar voice. My. I closed my eyes. Not him. Please, not him. I turned slowly. The angel stood nearby, holding a pastry. How he acquired the pastry I neither knew nor cared, but he waved cheerfully. I considered pretending not to recognize him, but unfortunately the little man had already begun walking toward me. Beautiful balloon. I swear, I said, if you have come to mock me, Mock you? The angel looked wounded. My dear fellow, I came to watch. The last word struck me like a bucket of cold water. Watch. That was what he had said before, right before the window incident. The memory returned instantly. The crowd, the rope, the laughter, the grin. For the first time, a tiny thread of doubt slipped through my certainty. The angel noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. For a brief moment, his expression softened, almost kindly. Perhaps, he said, you should go home. I stared. What? Go home. The angel looked up at the balloon, then back at me. His smile returned, smaller now, more mysterious. You're standing unusually close to tomorrow's problem. Now, I wish I could tell you that I listened. I wish I could tell you that the angel's warning finally penetrated the thick armor of my stubbornness. I wish I could tell you that I paused, reflected upon recent events, and made the wise decision to return home. Instead, I laughed in his face. Not because I felt confident. The truth is, confidence had begun abandoning me several disasters ago. No, I laughed because I was angry. Angry men often mistake defiance for courage. The angel watched patiently as my laughter faded. Then he took a bite of his pastry, a remarkably large bite, the sort of bite that suggested the pastry had personally offended him. Very well, he said. I offered. Offered what? A chance. A chance for what? To learn the easy way." The angel shrugged. "Most people prefer the difficult way." And before I could respond, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the crowd. I pushed after him immediately, or I tried to. Unfortunately, a large gentleman carrying 3 cages of chickens chose that exact moment to cross my path. The collision was spectacular. Feathers exploded into the air. Chickens voiced their objections. The crowd scattered. By the time the order was restored, the angel had vanished. Naturally, he always vanished. I was beginning to suspect that appearing and disappearing dramatically was one of his official duties. The balloon, meanwhile, was nearly ready. Workers moved about the launch area, making final preparations. Spectators pressed closer. Excitement spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Whatever doubts remained in my mind were quickly overwhelmed by curiosity. After all, how dangerous could it be? History records many unfortunate statements, and that one deserves a place near the top of that list. The ascent began smoothly, beautifully, in fact. The balloon rose with such grace that for a moment I felt foolish for ever having worried. The city spread majestically beneath us. Buildings shrank, streets narrowed. People became tiny moving specks. The higher we climbed, the more magnificent the view became. Clouds drifted lazily apart, and sunlight bathed the landscape in gold. The world appeared peaceful, orderly, reasonable, exactly the sort of world I preferred. I remember smiling. I remember thinking that perhaps the entire miserable chain of accidents was finally behind me. And that, as experience repeatedly demonstrated, was the precise moment one should never become optimistic. The trouble began with a sound, a small sound, barely noticeable, a faint tearing noise. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Then it came again, longer this time, louder. The operator heard it too. His face changed instantly. One glance upward told him everything. The expression that followed told me the rest. There are certain facial expressions that require no explanation. Pure terror is one of them. I looked up. A section of the balloon had torn. Not completely, well, not yet, but enough. Enough to transform a pleasant excursion into an emergency. The operator began shouting instructions. Most of them were useless. The remainder were impossible. The balloon lurched violently. The basket swung. The earth tilted. For several horrifying moments, gravity seemed uncertain about its responsibilities. Then came the wind. A powerful gust seized the balloon and hurled us sideways. The city rushed beneath us. Roofs flashed past, chimneys blurred, church steeples appeared alarmingly close. The basket struck something. All of a sudden, I saw wood splintering and I heard someone screaming. It may have been me. The balloon surged higher, then lower, then sideways again. At this point, I abandoned all attempts at dignity. I clung desperately to whatever appeared least likely to detach itself. The world became a chaos of motion and noise. Above me, the damaged balloon groaned. Below me, the city rushed past. Around me, the wind howled like a living thing. And through it all, I heard laughter. Faint at first, almost lost beneath the storm of sound. Then, clearer. It was distinct, impossible laughter. I twisted around. There, floating impossibly close to the basket, was the angel of the odd. He appeared to be sitting comfortably upon nothing whatsoever. One leg crossed over the other, bottle in hand, watching. The little monster was actually watching. He raised the bottle in greeting. "Interesting day." My response was not suitable for publication. The angel seemed delighted. "I must admit," he said, "this is one of my better efforts." "Get away from me!" "Oh, I couldn't." He looked genuinely surprised. "This is the important part." The balloon dropped suddenly. My stomach attempted to escape through my throat. The angel drifted alongside us effortlessly, as though riding an invisible chair. "Still believe everything is coincidence?" "Yes!" The answer emerged automatically, partly from conviction, partly from terror. The angel sighed. "I admire persistence." The basket slammed into another rooftop. The impact nearly threw me over the side. For one dreadful second, I found myself dangling outside the basket. Only a desperate grip prevented a very short and very final journey. The angel winced. "Ooh." "Oh?" "That looked unpleasant." I stared at him in disbelief. The balloon lurched again. This time, something snapped. A rope. A very important rope. The basket tilted sharply. My grip failed. Suddenly, there was nothing beneath me. Nothing around me. Nothing except open air. The city stretched far below. The wind roared past my ears, and I began to fall. Now, we all know that there are moments when the mind becomes extraordinarily clear. And this was one of them. 1,000 thoughts flashed through my head. Regrets, mistakes, embarrassments, unpaid bills, awkward conversations, every foolish thing I had ever done. And among them all, one realization stood above the rest. The angel had warned me. Twice. At this moment, I was falling. There are few experiences that sharpen the mind more effectively than plummeting toward Earth. The world below rushed upward with alarming enthusiasm, and rooftops, streets, trees, and chimneys merged into a blur of color and motion. The wind tore at my clothing. My hat vanished, and one shoe followed shortly thereafter. I remember being strangely annoyed about the shoe. Yeah, I know, a man facing imminent destruction doesn't always think noble thoughts. In fact, he rarely does. But for one terrible instant, I became convinced that my story was about to end. Not heroically, not tragically, not even dramatically. Simply, splat. The sort of ending that causes future generations to shake their heads and say, "Well, that was unfortunate." Then something struck me. Not the ground, something else. A heavy jolt snapped through my body. The fall stopped so abruptly that every bone I possessed immediately filed a former complaint. For several moments, I hung motionless, blinking, breathing, alive, very much alive. Slowly, very slowly, I opened my eyes. Above me stretched a vast tangle of fabric. Below me lay the street. Much closer than I preferred, but not close enough to kill me. The damaged balloon had descended beneath me during the chaos of the fall. By some absurd combination of luck, timing, and cosmic mischief, I had become entangled in part of the collapsing envelope. The material had wrapped around me like an enormous net. I was bruised, terrified, even humiliated, but I was alive. The realization arrived gradually, then all at once. Alive! Alive! I began laughing. The laughter burst from me uncontrollably, part relief, part exhaustion, part disbelief. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, and then a familiar voice interrupted. "Remarkable." The laughter stopped immediately. I looked down, naturally, and there stood the angel of the odd. The little man was leaning against a fence, examining me with professional satisfaction. like an artist admiring a completed painting or a chef evaluating a particularly successful meal. I groaned. The angel tipped his hat. "Good afternoon." I closed my eyes. "Please go away." "You survived." "Yeah, I noticed." "Very impressive." "It wasn't impressive." "No?" "No." The words emerged through clenched teeth. "It was ridiculous." The angel's grin widened. "Exactly." For the first time since our acquaintance began, I had no reply. The little man wandered closer. The balloon fabric shifted gently in the breeze above me. People were already gathering nearby. They were pointing, whispering, preparing, no doubt, to laugh at my newest catastrophe. But, strangely enough, I no longer cared. I was too tired, too sore, too overwhelmed. And that's when I noticed that the angel studied me carefully. Then his expression softened, only slightly, but enough. "Well?" I sighed. The sound seemed to drain years from my life. "Well, what?" "Have you learned anything?" The question hung in the air. A few weeks earlier, I would have answered immediately. I would have delivered a speech, a lecture, a defense on reason and logic. But now I found myself hesitating. Because the truth was more complicated. I mean, I still believed in reason. I still believed in evidence. I still believed that the universe followed laws. Yet, I could no longer ignore what had happened. The endless chain of absurdity, the impossible timing, the sheer outrageousness of it all. Life, I was beginning to suspect, possessed a sense of humor, and not always a gentle one. The angel waited patiently. At last, I nodded. A very small nod. The smallest nod in human history, but a nod nonetheless. The little man smiled. He didn't smile triumphantly and not mockingly, but almost warmly. "As I thought." I looked at him. "What exactly are you?" The angel considered the question, and then he shrugged. "A reminder." "A reminder of what?" His eyes sparkled. "That certainty is dangerous." I sat quietly a moment. The crowd continued growing. Someone had begun pointing in my direction. Another was laughing. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have annoyed me. Now, it seemed oddly appropriate. Eventually, I asked the question that had troubled me from the beginning. "Were you really responsible for everything?" The angel laughed, a deep wheezing laugh that shook his entire round frame. "Oh, heavens, no." The answer surprised me. "No? Of course not." He wiped a tear from his eye. "I merely helped." That answer somehow explained everything and nothing at the same time. The angel adjusted his crooked hat. Then he looked toward the sky. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink, and long shadows stretched across the street. The day was ending. Our conversation, it seemed, was ending as well. The little man took a step forward, and then another. I had seen this before. The beginning of one of his disappearances. "Wait." The angel paused. "What now?" I hesitated, then smiled despite myself. "Thank you." The little fellow blinked. For the first time since I had met him, he appeared genuinely surprised. Then he laughed again, not loudly and not cruelly. He laughed with simple delight. "You're welcome." And with that, he was gone. No flash of light, no cloud of smoke, no dramatic miracle. One moment he stood before me, the next moment he did not. I never saw him again, at least not directly, yet Over the years, whenever an event occurred that was just a little too strange, a little too unlikely, a little too ridiculous, I would find myself smiling. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could almost hear a familiar voice, a cheerful voice, a laughing voice, a voice scented faintly of whiskey. Interesting. And whenever I heard it, I was careful not to lean too far out any windows. The end. And there you have it, everyone. A humorous tale about coincidence, bad luck, stubborn pride, and the dangers of being a little too certain that you're always right. And thanks for spending your time here with us at the Sounds of Stories. Come back for another adventure. And remember, when the world seems to fade, the stories always remain.